Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the ANH 2025 Online Learning Labs. My name is Shaylin Cullen, and I am the technical manager for this session entitled Evaluating Evidence Across Agriculture, Health, and Nutrition, a systemic approach to weighing up evidence in the integrative food security phase classification. The session is chaired by Scott Trimey, Ryan Freeman, and Yanni Armstrong from the IPC. Thank you for taking part in ANH 2025, and we look forward to a robust and interactive session today.
Thanks, Shaylin. Thanks for that note of welcome. And I'll just start by quickly introducing myself and then maybe quickly ask my colleagues to do the same. My name is Yanni, and I am the Learning and Research Coordinator for the Integrated Phase Classification Global Support Unit based in Rome. Scott?
Thanks, Annie. My name is Scott Trimmy. I'm the lead academic expert, so essentially work with strengthening collaboration between the IPC and different academic institutions globally. I'm also with the GSU, based in Cape Town, South Africa. Ryan.
Thank you, Scott. Good to see everybody today. My name is Ryan Freeman. I'm also a member of the Global Support Unit. I'm the Risk Analysis Team Leader, which more relates to risk monitoring and active support to technical analyses. Thank you for coming today.
Na tena ninataka kusema hujambo kila mtu pale Dar es Salaam. Tumeshukuru sana tuko pamoja na wewe leo na asante sana. So as we're going to go, I'm going to go through here and just give a few moments of introduction to talk a little bit about the IPC. And I think it would be useful for us also as we're going forward to understand a little bit more where you're at as well. So if you know anything about the IPC or what you do know about the IPC, please do pop that in the chat as well. And that will help us to understand where we are all in this. I'm delighted to see that we have participants here from FAO, from CRS, from other organizations who are indeed part of the IPC partnership. So please do let us know where you're coming from in terms of what you know about the IPC one way or the other, and this would be very helpful. I'm going to talk to you for about 5 minutes, and then I'm going to pass this over to Ryan, who will begin to get us into the heart of the conversation. And from there, we'll work with, all three of us will work with you to try to show you how it is, what we do. So we're talking today about how we evaluate evidence across agriculture and health and nutrition in terms of weighing up evidence that goes into the IPC. The IPC itself, as the name suggests, is the Integrated Phase Classification, and it's a partnership which is made up of now 21 different organizations, 19 of which are listed here, 2 of which joined so recently we haven't actually updated our templates yet, but we'll do that soon. And it's funded by those parties you see at the bottom. And what the IPC is designed to do is to try to develop is to have a common scale for classifying food insecurity and malnutrition, with a particular focus on crisis and emergencies. And the way that it does this is it puts forward an evidence-based technical consensus among key stakeholders, which gives us a kind of common platform for understanding the dimensions and the parameters of a particular food insecurity situation or crisis. It provides actionable knowledge for strategic decision-making. It says what needs to be done in a situation and by whom. It's rigorous and neutral. We have no programming presence. We are very limited in terms of funding. Our role is simply to provide the analysis and then let those parties who are in a position to respond take it up. So we have no dog in this fight one way or the other. And it is a partnership. We are administratively housed in something called the Global Support Unit, which works as kind of a secretariat for the IPC itself, but it is made up, as I say, of these 21 partners. And the reason for this is that historically, going back 25 years now, there was a moment when there was very little. Food security is necessarily a complex construct, which has a huge range of factors which are involved in it and which it implicates. And as a consequence, it's been very difficult historically to understand what food security or food insecurity looks like. And the IPC was an attempt to try to classify food security crises when food insecurity was taking over from food security into a standard 5-phase scale, which is represented here at the bottom. And as part of that, also then to develop a way in which the reporting and the explanation of such crises would be standardized. So At the core of the IPC is there's a five-phase scale, which is regrettably all too familiar these days, from 1 being minimal on one side to phase 5 being famine at the other. The IPC remains the only globally recognized entity which can classify famines. So the work we do tries to answer 6 questions, which is how many people are food insecure, how badly off are they, why is this happening, where, what is the nature of these people, and when is this happening? We try to do 2 things here. We try to make this comparable across time and across space. So on the top right there, you see time series data from Somalia, which is slightly stylized, but nevertheless, we've been working in Somalia now for 20 years. And we have very good time series data to explain how food security or food insecurity has been experienced over that 20-year period. Similarly, because the scale is standardized, you can compare different geographic, different territories. So here you see again an indicative comparison between Zimbabwe, South Sudan, Yemen, and CAR. So these are the things that the IPC permits. What is it? So what the IPC then looks like? This is an analysis that we just completed for South Sudan. There's a QR code in the top right corner. If you scan that, it will take you to the most recent South Sudan analysis, which was concluded just last week. The IPC gives you a number. It gives you a total number of the population who are food insecure, and that population is then indicated and classified by phase. It does the same thing for acute malnutrition. It provides a map and a narrative to explain the nature of the crisis as it's being experienced by people. What are the dimensions and the parameters of that crisis? It provides a population table like this in the bottom left, which shows you where are those folks and what phase are they in. This is at state level, but we do indeed go one administrative level before that down to district level, and that's also available. And then we also, as necessary, provide additional information on famine or risk of famine as applicable. In South Sudan, we did indeed identify 2 places for that. The information we produce and the analysis we produce is the foundational basis for a number of major humanitarian appeals, humanitarian needs overviews, flash appeals, and the flagship document that our findings are combined into is the Global Report on Food Crisis, which comes out every spring, usually April or May, reporting mostly on IPC data. But we are used in a range of other means, as you can see across these here. And currently, we're in about 35 countries. That number expands and it fluctuates somewhat, but we're at about 35 right now. We have a sister institution in West Africa called the Cadre Harmonisé, which is completely integrated with the IPC, but is slightly unique to West Africa. But this gives you an indication as to where we are, from Timor in the Far East to the Latin American states in the North American continent. So that's a little bit of overview. I'm going to pop over to the chat now and see what you all know about this and see if this has sparked any questions for you. But what we're going to do in this session is we're going to look at how evidence is analyzed for the IPC. We draw in evidence from a range of different domains, from economics, public health, meteorology, agriculture, sociology, political science, and bring it all together. And this is what is the basis for our analyses. And we want to introduce you a little bit to the indicators we use, and then give you a chance to kind of go through some of this multi-sectoral information that we work with to try to figure out how then to characterize a food insecurity crisis. And then we'll come back together and talk about what we found and how that all fits together, and see what you all think about the way that we work. So with that, I think Ryan, I'm going to stop my share and pass the baton on to you. But thanks. I look forward to hearing from you shortly.
So this session that we're going to be going over, it's going to be around 40 to 50 minutes, is going to be talking about the evidence, the way that an IPC analysis really looks at the available data. How do we try to use that as analysts? What are some of the different challenges that we may have? And what are some of the indicators that we use for different aspects of food insecurity or acute malnutrition or other concerning particular phenomena that we would like to cover? And also this word that you may hear a lot in the IPC, if you've been in analyses before, is convergence. How do we take all of this and we bring it down together to make sense from complexity, as Yanni was presenting all those pictures of agriculture and satellite images and different indicators into something that is into a 5-point scale. So when we start here, this is an easy way to center our discussion. This is going to be the IPC Integrated Conceptual Food Security and Nutrition Framework. Now, we always talk about food security and nutrition when we talk about the overall IPC, because these are the two different scales or the two phenomena that we're very, very interested in analyzing. Now, as Yanni was mentioning, we are in over 30 countries. We conduct regular analyses every year, anywhere between 60 to 80 analyses, both on food security and nutrition. And this is a particular framework that allows us to do that. When we look at this analytical framework, we see that on the very top, these are mortality, nutritional status. You see these blue and green shades. What's important to note here is on these slides, you'll notice blue and green are mixed throughout this analytical framework. And this is because not all aspects are related to nutrition, or not all aspects are directly related to food insecurity. Some can come from either, or they can be unique. As an example, the very, very familiar elements or the pillars of food security, food availability, access, utilization, and stability, you can see here on the screen in the middle in blue. These are a very, very centered discussion within the food security analyses. Whereas if we move to the acute malnutrition framework and some of these specific elements in green, you start looking at caring and feeding practices, health services and environmental health, health status. But when we look at an IPC analysis, whether it's acute food insecurity or acute malnutrition, we are interested in this relationship between acute food insecurity and acute malnutrition. This is why when we see this integrated conceptual framework, you can see how food security and nutrition are at the heart of these discussions. And when we start moving into our discussions on vulnerability or resources and control and context, this is about food security and nutrition. When we talk about acute events, these may be natural, socioeconomic, conflict, disease, or others, which may have an impact more directly related to the nutritional status or your acute food insecurity status. However, it's very important to be as broad and inclusive in this discussion and this analytical pathway. We're going to go through these with some examples, and we're going to walk you through what you'll see here on the next slide is the IPC analytical food security analytical framework. So here we're going to be focusing a little bit more on the food security analytical framework. However, through our discussion, you will actually notice how much of the elements we're going to be discussing, the topics we're going to be discussing, actually are related to health, water, sanitation, protection, and other elements that would be, let's say, beyond the traditional food security analysis. So when we look at this analytical framework, you have the left side of the screen and the right side of the screen. If you follow along from the top left of the screen, you see the food security contributing factors. These are a way for us to break down a very complicated context, a complicated environment. And how do we want to look at a particular country or scenario and see how do we want to start this discussion? So we start off with these discussions, usually talking about the vulnerability of populations, the resources of control. This may be more specific to livelihood strategies. So what are the food and income sources? What are the coping and expenditures that may be within inside the household or in the community? It may be on the livelihood assets. So it could be the human, financial, social, physical, or even natural. You're also going to be looking at the PIPs, or the policies, institution, and processes that may be in play in this particular environment. We're also going to be looking at gender and other socioeconomic inequalities and discrimination, minority groups, others, factors of inclusion and exclusion within a particular society or community. And also we are going to be looking at mitigating factors. Now, mitigating factors, of course, can be very, very important in an analysis. I think we have 33 participants, and of course, if we say let's find one thing wrong with a particular community or the community's ability to be food secure, we'll probably have 60, 70, maybe 80 different views. And when we ask that same question on mitigating factors, we usually get a lot less. It's always easier to think of the negative and sometimes harder to think of a positive when we move forward in some of these environments. This is why it's specifically highlighted here. Now that we understand that overall context, we get an understanding of, let's say, vulnerability over time. We have another discussion on vulnerability, and maybe it's a different demographic group. Maybe it's a particular area within this region. That we have that discussion and we start and we move forward into the next discussion, which is on acute events or ongoing conditions. So this is where we are really interested in the IPC analysis when we start talking about the context. Now what's happened or what's happening in this context? So in the case, if we choose maybe Haiti as an example, you may have a cyclone that came through or a hurricane that came through right during the analysis or right during the planning season. So this would be a major shock. If we move to more urban environments, we could say maybe even Kinshasa and others, you may find other shocks or acute events. Or if you go to other areas, you may also have zoonotic or livestock disease outbreaks that may be decimating ruminant populations in a rural community. All three of these are different acute events or conditions that are taking place within this community or particular area of analysis. So it's very important once we know the context, the next step is to look at what's happened and the impact of what's happened or what is currently ongoing in those areas. And how do we do this? We move forward from context and what's happening or what recently happened to talk about the impact. What is the impact on this? Now, of course, measuring impact and discussing the impact, it's a very big question. So this analytical framework tries to orient us on the traditional pillars of food security. So we have availability and stability, you have access and stability, and you have utilization and stability. When we have that discussion on availability, it's no surprise to probably many of the colleagues online. This is a discussion on the production, the wild foods, maybe the imports, or what may be physically available to a population or to an area in a particular country or context. Another way we're going to be looking at that is the access. What are the different access pathways that these communities or individuals or households have to those different available food resources or food sources? So physical access, this is a good example of maybe I have a farm, I have the crops that are physically available behind my house, they're in the community, I can have physical access and go to get them. Financial access, there again, we would be looking more on purchasing power of households, the market access, the purchasing of goods, the use of financial resources to access food, whether that's in a market or in other available sources. Social access. Let's say that I don't have a particular farm in my backyard. I don't have, let's say, the means to purchase food, but I may get it through my community. I may get it through my neighbors. I may get it through other social safety nets. There may be food programs. There may be other social safety nets that provide me access, not financially or physically, but through my social status or standing as a registered citizen or as a recipient of a particular program. So we measure this impact, we talk about availability, we talk about access, we also move over to utilization. Now, within the IPC, we try to focus this discussion on utilization a little bit more on, excuse me, on food preferences, preparation, practices, storage, a little bit on food safety, and also water access. The quality of the water, is it safe? And these other aspects of, is it from an improved source of water? Is it from an unimproved source of water? What would be the associated risks? In addition to this, there's also discussions within the IPC on utilization, both on how does the household use the food resources that are available within a household. There are often discussions whether it's certain demographic groups that eat first or last, age groups that may eat more or less, certain groups that may be excluded or eat at a different time. So that also may change their consumption patterns and all sorts of different related elements. So when we talk about utilization, yes, it's about food storage, it's about preparation, but it's also equally important to talk about the utilization of food resources within the household. So now, if we look at the left side of the screen, we have talked about a context, an environment, a particular area of a country. We've talked about what's happened in terms of a recent shock or ongoing conditions. We've talked about the impact, and we've broken it down into the different food security pillars. Now we're moving to the right side of the analytical framework, and these are what we call the first level outcomes on the bottom right. These are food consumption and livelihood change. You'll notice there are a few gray arrows and a few gray boxes here. This is important because on the analytical framework, there's only one first level outcome, food consumption, which is directly related to food security. The other three, livelihood change, mortality, and nutritional status, also have non-food security specific contributing factors or drivers. But when we move over from the impact and we start talking about the outcomes, we want to know about the impact on the available food, the access to those foods and the use of those feed resources. And what does it relate to? What is the outcome of all of that impact on a household or an individual? And these are where we have very specific outcome indicators to help us assess these changes, whether positive or negative. We'll have a session in just a little bit where we dive into some of these indicators, and you can also let us know which indicators from food consumption or livelihood change that you're most interested in talking about, and also on the second level outcomes. So when we're in our first level outcomes of food consumption and livelihood change, as a household, if I am consuming a certain level and if I have adapted certain strategies or employing certain assets, what does that do? And this brings us to our second level outcomes. What does this mean in terms of my or my family's nutritional status? What does this mean in terms of the mortality or excess mortality that may or may not be happening? So this is how, within the IPC, we take all of this information that's available from the context about individual shocks, whether it's a flood or a disease outbreak. We walk it through the food security dimensions and traditional pillars. Then we talk about the impact on that on food consumption and livelihood change, and how does a household with those consumption and livelihood change, say, patterns, how does this result in their nutritional status and mortality? So this is a very quick way to go through the IPC analytical framework. And this is something that we do on a regular basis and analyses for a current period of time, let's say for maybe a month, and also moving ahead, looking forward for a projection period. Let's say what could happen in 6 months' time. So it allows us to have this structured discussion, whether we're talking about the present or a future situation. Now, let me see if I can just hide this. There we go. So when we talk about the IPC reference table and how we move from the analytical framework to the reference table, as Yanni was mentioning, this is a scale. It's a standardized scale. You apply it over time and space. To do that, we do need a standard set of indicators that allow us to have this comparison. We need to have something that structures the way that we go through our analytical framework and we measure these positive and negative changes. So moving from our analytical framework on the left to our IPC reference table on the right, you'll see that each of these, let's say, bars are organized by the different outcome indicators, the first level outcomes and the second level outcomes that we would like to capture within the IPC analysis. You'll have food consumption, you'll have your livelihood change, you have additional detail on mortality, and you also have different information that's available. What's really interesting is when we present this in country to regular analysts, when we're in a training, just about to start the analysis, there's always a question on how is this reference table updated, or when was it updated, or how did we create this? And for each of these individual indicators that you may see in this reference table and the individual cutoffs for each of the 5 phases, there's normally been enormous amounts of work, statistical studies and others that have verified, produced, tested, piloted, revised, and adapted, and eventually finalized and become internationally recognized to be used in this food security analysis. So when we look at the IPC reference table, you'll see these phases that Yanni was mentioning before. This is phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, phase 5, and they go from left to right. It's very important to note that this is an absolute scale. It's not a relative scale. There's no phase 6, there's no phase 0. These are the cutoffs that we use. We have standard definitions, and it is an absolute scale. So we have 5 phases, where each has their own general description of the severity of the condition, and also each phase has a priority response objective attached to it. So as an example, if you're looking at phases 1 or 2, you may be looking at more disaster risk reduction or resilience programming. Once you start moving across the IPC phases to the right, increasing severity, you're increasing the challenges that households are facing. In IPC phase 3 crisis, the urgent, immediate action is needed to protect livelihoods and reduce food consumption gaps. Moving forward to phase 4, this is about saving lives and livelihoods. And in phase 5, catastrophe or famine, this is revert or prevent widespread death and total collapse of livelihoods. So you can see that as we move from phase 1 to phase 5, it gets incrementally more severe. And our reference table allows us to do that as well. It allows us to talk about our first level outcomes, our second level outcomes, and some of these contributing factors as we start to see them move from phase 1 to 5. And also from, let's say, phase 5, 4, 3 down as situations improve to better periods of food security. So what you'll also notice here is that we have indicators for each of the first level and second level outcomes here, and most of them have a unique indicator or a range or threshold, as we'll call it, for each of the IPC phases. So when partners in the field collect data, they're very, very familiar with the results and whether this is highlighting, according to these indicators, what would be the associated IPC indicative phase. So these cutoffs are very helpful for the outcome indicators, but they're not standardized, they're not harmonized, they're not consistent for a lot of the contributing factors that you'll see in many of the contexts and analyses. We're going to go through this discussion, and I'm really happy to hear your feedback on your ideas on this as well, whether you think there are different ways of looking at contributing factors, non-standardized approaches for particular phenomenon country related to food security. Now, this slide is a little busy, and I really just want to pause here for a few minutes. What I'd like to do here is really to talk about some of the food consumption indicators, go through them, and explain a little bit about them. But what I would like to do maybe before I jump in is everyone familiar with at least one or two of these indicators? If you've never seen any of them before, it may be very interesting to write that in the chat as well. And for those that are maybe more familiar with indicators, I'd really like to hear which ones that you're more familiar with and which ones that you've maybe never seen or never used. And what I would like to do, and I'll have colleagues Scott and Yanni help me with this, is we'll ask the chat, which one of these, maybe one or two of these 6 indicators from food consumption would you like to have a little bit more of a dedicated discussion on? And we can talk about maybe one, two, or three of these indicators, and then we can apply it to a context. So first we understand what the indicator is, we talk about limitations, some usages, and then we can also apply it to a particular context, whether it's a sudden onset or a protracted crisis. So what I would like everybody to do now is, if you have access to the chat, then try to write down the indicator that you are most interested in talking about today, whether it's about food consumption score or the household hunger scale or the HEA, the household economic approach, or any of the ones that you see here on screen. Very happy to go through those in great detail. But I'm really happy to hear from you, to see your interest. Now that I'm sharing screen, I can't see the chat per se, so I'll pass over to Scott and Yanni, maybe just to read out some of the feedback if we have some.
Yes, thanks, Ryan. And thanks all of you who've already popped something in the chat. The early going is between RCSI and HEA. A couple of those, right now it's a dead heat between those two and also HHS. Hillary's just come through with food consumption score and household hunger score, which shades it. Oh no, there's Rahima with HEA. It looks like HEA is coming in slightly stronger, but we don't have a. I would say it would be. I think it looks like HEA would be the first choice, Ryan, followed by household hunger score, I would think. But you also have interest on RCSI and FCS, and one vote for dietary energy as well. So something of a dealer's choice there, I fear. But
Cool.
yes, I hope that's of some use. And thanks to everybody who voted. There will be a couple more chances to cast your opinion here. So please keep those fingers that are ready. Ryan, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for sharing that feedback. I think the only one that was not identified was the HDDS, or the Household Dietary Diversity Score, and that's fine. We have a long list in front of us. So the household economic approach is a very detailed analysis that's done. And generally this is done by looking at, and I'm sure many of the colleagues online may have already done one before, but this is looking at the baseline of the livelihoods in a particular area, looking at all sorts of information from the standard and regular practices in a normal year. Now, of course, how do you define a normal year? There's a discussion there. And when we start talking about the baseline, you start getting a lot of information on, let's say, a particular livelihood group and what households do within this particular area. You can also have a little bit more of a detailed analysis on, maybe it's on wealth quintiles, maybe it's on different livelihood groups. You can really break down this HEA approach to talk about different demographic groups that don't necessarily fall across an administrative boundary very easily. So you can use this approach, and you do start looking at this from the end of the analysis. This is where the HEA baseline will give you what's happening in a typical year for a particular population, and you're going to be looking at deficits. So what happens in a normal year? What's the change from the baseline? And what does it mean in terms of the deficit and the survival deficit? So this is very helpful for IPC analyses, because when we start moving for, let's say, non-urban environments, it's a very, very helpful practice to talk about the household economic approach and what does this mean in terms of the livelihoods that they have, the impact on the livelihoods, and what type of protection deficit. So what is the impact on livelihoods and the ability of populations to deal with that shock? How much is that shock, let's say, from normal and the impacts? And also moving forward where we start talking about the survival deficit. What would be needed in terms of the survival deficit between ranges? And this allows us to have a discussion on what of the IPC phases 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 that may be more helpful. For the IPC, we can use a HEA baseline within the last 10 years. And the idea is, once you have an HEA analysis done, you don't typically update the baseline very often. You keep the baseline as it's a good year, it's been identified as a normal year. Then you can run your analysis, inputting different variables depending on the context that you're faced with. And it's very helpful. It's a very complicated analysis. It takes usually a bit of training, and there's a whole analysis that needs to be done just to get to your outputs. But it's very welcome in the IPC analysis, and I think it's heavily used in East and Southern Africa, and also some other regions where the IPC is currently active. So if we talk about the HEA, and we talk about a sudden onset or a protracted crisis, what do the colleagues feel online would be the most applicable for adapting to a sudden onset emergency, or is it more applicable for a protracted crisis? Happy to hear your thoughts in the chat there as well. So I'll pass over to Yanni and Scott.
Right. Thanks, Ryan. So a couple of questions on HEA. There's a comment here from Irina who says, if HEA feels like a very complex indicator compared to the rest of the indicators, am I right in thinking it's a qualitative type of data?
So the HEA is very complicated, and you do use qualitative elements. You can use those to inform your analysis, but the outputs are a lot more quantitative. You have two of those outputs, the survival deficit and the livelihood protection deficit. Both are quantitative, but you do use qualitative information during that process if it's available to help inform first the baseline and then setting your parameters for your updated analysis.
Okay, and then there's a comment from Rahima here on Rahima that a couple of comments here on HEA, and that they feel that HEA could be functional in both context sudden and protracted, but would give more detail in a protracted livelihood crisis. And Sarah thinks that HEA would be slightly more useless in a protracted crisis context. Would that? How would you? Was this a fair summary, Ryan?
I see. As always, we have different opinions, which is very good.
So I should clarify. Sarah specifies that she did not mean useless; she meant useful. So a bit of an editorial twist there. So indeed, the statement would be HEA would be slightly more useful in a protracted crisis context.
Okay. I can tell you from, I'm not an HEA expert, but from what I've seen it used in the IPC analyses, it has been used in probably more protracted crises. However, this really depends on the context where you're analyzing. If you have a baseline that's available from a good year, less than 10 years, that is still relatively fresh, and you do have a sudden onset disaster or emergency or a shock, you can very quickly run the HEA analysis, and you can have your survival deficit and your livelihood protection deficit very quickly, because you don't necessarily need to have large data collection initiatives in country. Think of after an earthquake. It may be very difficult to get firsthand data from the ground in all of the earthquake affected areas. However, if you have enough information to input to update your baseline based off a shock, this is a valuable way of looking at these particular approaches to acute food insecurity. So it does work in both. It has advantages for some, and it has disadvantages for others. It is complex. It does take time. Usually there's specialized training needed. And in my experience, not many analysts are familiar with it. So even if it is available, you need a training session with all of the other analysts to see how we incorporate it. If I could move over to maybe the reduced coping strategy index and maybe the household hunger scale. We've got a bit of time, so I can go through a little bit of these. The reduced coping strategy index, or the RCSI. So this is a very interesting indicator. It talks about over the period of 7 days, the previous 7 days. And the way that I always like to talk to analysts about this is when a household doesn't have enough food, or they're under stress, or they're facing a shock, what are the coping strategies that they can use that are food-based coping strategies. And you can think of this as, it's very helpful to talk about it when we think of utilization. How does the household use the food resources that they have when they're facing a shock or a stress, accumulated stress? So what this reduced coping strategy index does is it identifies several different responses, whether it's reducing the meal size, eating, let's say, fewer meals per day, who gets to eat the meals first. So it allows us to capture some of these experiences that individuals may be using and facing during situations of stress or following a shock. This isn't, and we'll get to this on the next slide, this is not about selling off livelihood assets or making a livelihood change. This is all about food-based coping. And this is one way I usually describe it to analysts is food-based coping. This is about the use of household food resources. And this allows us to talk about in the previous 7 days before the data collection, what was the household doing to respond to these types of shocks? Now, typically, the RCSI is more sensitive to recent shocks. If you are in a country where, let's say, your typical number of meals was 3, and over time it's been a protracted crisis, that 2 went to maybe 2.5, and now it's down to 2.5, now it's maybe down to 2 meals a day. Over time, the normal level of meals keeps reducing. So if you're asking a household if they have, what are they going to do when they face this shock? Or what have they done rather in the past 7 days? They may not say, I've reduced my meal size, because it's already been reduced. So this particular indicator really helps us following a major shock. It's a little less helpful in protracted crises that would already have these food-based coping strategies, either long-term, let's say, usage, or they've already been adapted for quite some time. So the change from normal is a lot harder to measure, and also the change from normal, in this case, maybe 1 meal a day. But if that's what they've had, you're not going to reduce. So it's a little difficult applying the RCSI, but it does allow us to look at the previous 7 days. What did the household do with a lot of the food resources that they had? It also helps us in relation to discussions on nutrition, on who gets to eat, what are the practices there, who eats first, are kids prioritized or other groups prioritized? So it's a very helpful indicator. And it allows us, there again, a little bit more information into this discussion on acute food insecurity at the household level.
Thanks, Brian. That's a good summary. And I think I would just suggest to anyone for whom the indicators are of particular interest, or if you'd like to dig deeper into any of these, when we do go to breakout rooms, please follow Ryan. We're going to love you. You're going to take your pick as to which group you'd like to join. And he'll have a chance to go into these details, and we'll look at a few real data sets as well at that time. So if indicators are of interest, please follow him. Ryan, perhaps we could move on to your next slide at this point.
Sounds good. All right, we're about halfway through this main session, and I think we're moving forward quite well. So thanks for your participation as well. It's been very helpful. So when we talk about livelihood change, this is where we want to talk about the assets and livelihoods that a particular region may have. So this is at the household level, and it's a general description of what's happening within the household when the household does not have enough food, or they're facing a food shortage. What do they do? And this is the discussion on livelihood change. So it's not about the food-based coping. This is about what do you do with your assets and livelihoods and all of the different type of asset classes to account and cope with this particular shortage. So when we look at these are a lot more specific. These are defined by the context that you're looking at. These are going to be looking at either stress coping strategies, crisis coping strategies, and emergency coping strategies. And the IPC has on its reference table ways to look at and identify each of these different strategies and what phase they refer to. And it's important to note when we talk about livelihood change, we normally talk about four different responses. Let's say in a particular context, are households selling their land? So a typical answer could be yes, they are. They already have done in the past 30 days. No, because they've already sold it more than 30 days ago. No, they're not doing it, or it's not applicable to them. Maybe they don't own land to sell. So what this livelihood change indicator really allows us to do is dig in on the assets that a household may have and the strategies that may be available for that particular household in that context to cope. And it allows us to have a little bit more understanding on the options that they have and which ones they're using in any given context. So maybe I'll ask the colleagues online, do you think this is more applicable for rural or urban households? Happy to hear your thoughts there.
Okay, so Melody thinks it's more applicable for rural.
All right. Well, Melanie, it's definitely used in both, but predominantly it's, I think, more and more being used in urban, but it's you're always going to find it in rural populations. Most of these strategies that usually are discussed in countries are focusing on rural populations. However, we do have the ability within the coping strategy index. There's a long list of potential strategies for use, and you can adapt this for urban or rural. And I wanted to move us now to the next slide where we've talked about our consumption indicators, we've talked about livelihood change, and now we're talking about additional elements, contributing factors. I don't want to go into too much detail here because this is what our small group work is going to be discussing. But it is important to note that there are no universal thresholds for most of the contributing factors. They depend on the context, whether it's an urban environment, a rural environment, peri-urban environment, a protracted crisis, a sudden onset emergency. All of these contributing factors are very, very different, and how you interpret them depends on the context. So we do have some, however, that are on the reference table, and this does talk a little bit about the pillars of food security, so availability, access, utilization, stability. And this is where we're going to be talking about, I think here moving forward, is on hazards and vulnerability. So what do we see in terms of, I think, wash, nutrition, protection, agriculture, all of these different things that inform or are impacting food insecurity or acute malnutrition, that we don't necessarily have a standardized indicator for every country. And this is the really exciting part about IPC analyses, because you do come across new indicators, new sets of information. And we as analysts go through that exercise together to see how we use it in the IPC analytical framework. So we're going to go into these contributing factors in a lot more detail in the group work. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. And there again, this is on the reference table. And this is focusing on the nutritional status. Now, the nutritional status within the IPC, we look at this generally in two ways. However, there is a third option, and this is weight for height and the MOAC screening, or the mid-upper arm circumference. You also have the body mass index, but I've rarely ever seen it collected, let alone used in many of these emergency contexts. So there again, from the nutritional indicators that we do have the cutoffs. I think what is important to note is that the IPC prioritizes weight for height, as it's seen as a more precise and informative indicator, versus the MOAC, which is still used, but only when weight for height is not available, as the MOAC doesn't have a threshold for each IPC phase. It actually has phases for, a threshold for 2 phases. So instead of having a phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, you have 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and 4 to 5. Similarly on mortality, the way the IPC looks at mortality is the crude death rate and the under 5 death rate. And unfortunately, you do get a lot of this information in analyses. You start looking at these types of indicators mostly in phases 3, 4, and 5 when it becomes available. It may be available in SMART surveys or other particular surveys that capture mortality. But this moves us towards a little bit more of the phase 4, the phase 5, severe discussions on acute malnutrition, acute food insecurity, and the interaction between those and disease. So as you can see here, a general food security analysis is going to be looking at a lot of different information. And whether it's a conflict setting or a climatic event or shock, all of this discussion, all of these indicators can be collected and applied in assessments and used for the IPC. When we look at mortality, I think maybe just to end on one last note here for the mortality session, is that the IPC, the way we try to look at excess mortality is that it's trauma versus non-trauma. So if you're in a conflict setting, let's take, I don't know, maybe Somalia, it's very difficult to determine who or how many have died from, let's say, measles versus active conflict. So these mortality indicators are extremely informative. However, they're also very difficult to collect. And they're very difficult to collect in some contexts because they're very sensitive. And not all enumerators have the time, or populations also have the flexibility and willingness to talk about mortality. It can be a taboo topic in many, many societies. So I think that's what I had for some of the overarching discussion on the indicators, how we talk about it from the analytical framework, how we use them within the IPC, whether it's going to be a conflict setting or a climatic event, whether it's an urban or rural environment, or if it's going to be a sudden onset or a protracted crisis. All of these indicators can be used in different ways, and all of them allow us to try to better understand acute food insecurity and its relationships with all of these different indicators in those contexts. So we understand a little bit more about the household and all of these different contexts. So now that we have a bit of time, let's pause here and pass it over to Scott and Yanni to see if there's any questions in the chat, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Yanni, and thank you, Ryan. It's always superb just to get that type of overview so clearly drawn from years of experience in terms of making what often appears so complicated is so easy in terms of laying it out for us. And we've got a chance now to work together in probably the most exciting way in the actual convergence or dancing with evidence. So in other words, how within the technical direction and framing of the IPC, we can work with some experiences from evidence from historical data to really practice a little bit of what Ryan's been taking us through. So we've got a chance now to choose one of three groups. We're not going to randomly allocate. So this is really about seeing what type of group catches your fancy. Each of the groups is going to have a particular focus. They're going to be allocated a scenario, a story that emerges from a place in time. And each of those groups is going to very rapidly develop a short analysis. So to be able to come back to the plenary and tell that story of what's emerged, or justify it a little bit, hold that ground in terms of what the analysis is revealing. But also, just very briefly, using what we've got in hand, well, from that evidence, is we're going to try and classify that area as well, very rapidly. And we're going to share that as well in terms of plenary. So this is almost like launching ourselves back into the reality of IPC, the analysts working under time pressure, looking at evidence, holding things, trying to justify, using reason, and ultimately coming to an analysis. So we're going to have about half an hour in those small groups, and we're going to come back, share, and then we'll wrap this entire process up. So what are those three groups? So we've got those contributing factors, which Ryan really mentioned, those often those indicators that we don't necessarily have readily at hand, those indicators that are emerging in terms of research or studies that are happening on the ground, including what's happening with the bigger economics or trade, with health, with food security. Yanni's going to take that group in terms of really working with those contributing factors. Thanks, Yanni. I'm a historian by training, a political economist. I'm very interested in long time series on the temporal aspects. And I'm going to work with a group in terms of the kind of conclusions that we can reach in terms of making sense of the things of a kind, the patterns that emerge, including seasonality. So we're going to look a little bit at seasonal calendars, temporal aspects, and I'll hold that group. A big question is often the livelihood coping versus the food consumption, which Ryan has so sort of carefully taken us through in terms of often those big outcome indicators. So this really gets at the health, the pulsing heart of IPC. So Ryan's going to take a group in terms of really then holding up livelihood coping, food consumption, and really looking at some of those tensions that lie between these two, but also how they tell a very interesting story when you use clear analysis. So colleagues, Shailen's going to open up the three groups. You'll have a chance to choose. We'll slip away for about half an hour, return and share. So really looking forward to this interaction. And just encourage you to, just get stuck in. Please, no such thing as an incorrect answer. This is about building our analysis together. So thank you all for, I think, 3 wonderful sessions in terms of the engagement. The sense is there was a lot of very careful thought and exchange. Yanni, I'm going to turn to you just in terms of whether someone in your group would like to reflect just very briefly in terms of some high-level observations, some responses to some of those questions. Maybe a couple of minutes and we can do each of the groups and then we can bring it into a broader discussion. Thanks, Yanni.
Great. Thanks, Scott. And our group was a superb group. Lots of great discussion happening. And what we were looking at was contributing factors at kind of macroeconomic and health levels. We were looking at effectively factors which weren't specific to food to understand the kind of context of this country that you all were looking at in terms of seasonality or in terms of indicators. And I wonder if either Angeli or Rema would be good enough to kind of share some of their impressions with that. And I'll say also we did have a provisional classification. We think we know what phase this might be, and maybe one of them would be good enough to share that as well. So Rema or Angeli, would either of you be happy to talk?
Yeah, so this looked like a situation in urban where there is no access to food, there is no electricity, there are multiple NCDs, there are difficulties in the livelihood, and it seemed like multiple people are affected with multiple disorders. And in addition, there is some kind of a government aid with relation to food provision or subsidized food provision. But it appeared like there is some emergency situation which is happening, and if it is not taken care of, it might lead to severe situation there. This is my impression, and it looked like a urban situation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. That's a very good summary. And we looked a lot at the information on specifically on priority needs, especially electricity, and a very high import dependency. Rema, was there anything else that you might like to add for our group?
Yes, I think it was at the final analysis when we're looking at what phase this particular country based on its raw data might be on. So we took into cognizance the priority needs and the fact that there was already a 70% food ration for 23% of the population.
Right. So Rema's a little bit letting you peek behind our method. We were so interested in determining we wanted more context from the actual indicators that at some point we snuck over into your presentation, Ryan, and took a look at them because we felt strongly that we weren't able to fully contextualize those data without some harder information on the indicators. So we slightly cheated, but we did come up with a classification, and we'll get to it when the time's ready. So that's, I think that's it for our group. Scott, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Yanni. So really great. Really enjoyed that feedback. We looked at seasonality and the whole idea of what happens over time, and just understanding the nuance of what happens in a calendar year, what happens over a period of years. You can draw patterns, but suddenly you are impacted by a shock. Maybe that shock is something you expect, that there's a seasonality connected to it, or maybe it's something that is literally out of the blue, and what that means for a food system. And so we had I think for me, it was a really enjoyable way of deducing, trying to sort of assimilate as much as we could from as we built a story, and then held it at the end in terms of also reaching an analysis. So we look forward to sharing that. But I'd like to turn to, I think it's Melody. You will take us through, and Anna, you'll sort of feed into it as well as we feedback. Melody, over to you, high level sort of reflection.
Okay, so in the analysis, we found that there's a need to have the evidence to tell the whole story. So we walked through the seasonal calendars for the staples to identify when's the growing harvest, the sowing, growing, harvesting season, and when the hunger season overlaps, as well as the time when food is abundantly available. We try to look at the population data as well to identify or understand whether it's high density locations, rural versus urban, and as well whether they have access to markets. We also looked at the fruit and vegetable calendars, and when we saw that they had access to lots of fruits and vegetables year round, we were kind of deducing that this might be a market-based urban society as opposed to one that was producing their own food. And we examined and discussed about various points in time in households' lives when food or when there might be either stresses or shocks that affect how they can purchase food. So for example, school, we discussed about when school season starts and families have to buy uniforms, for example, pay school fees that might affect their food security. Also seasonal, such as winter, when they might need to buy fuel or heating or other winterized items, as well as events such as religious events like Ramadan or Christmas might also impact the household's ability to purchase or access food. And then we talked about various shocks as well, such as in this particular case study, it was a COVID-19 followed by a blast at a port, which then affected the ability to import their key foods that they were reliant on, and then followed by the Russian-Ukraine conflict, which then would have also impacted fuel, fertilizer, and other imports. So we tried to look at all of this and see it to kind of paint the whole picture. And we also in the process realized the importance of when one collects data on this also depends on what moment those families are at, and that families have to plan and their savings. Their savings and their food are very connected, and they would have to plan to be able to withstand those shocks to meet their food security needs. So Anna, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Melody. Actually, you did like a very, very great summary. So I think maybe the only thing that I can add, just like a broader takeaway, could be around the fact that you may not have always access to precise, detailed household level indicators, but you have a lot of different information at different level, national, global, like a lot of background information that you can use to build your case or to better understand, let's say, the situation that pictures in front of you. So it was very interesting. Thank you so much, Scott, again.
Thank you, Melody, and I really appreciate that. I'm not going to add to that. I really appreciate the way you've sort of brought it all together. Ryan, over to you and your wonderful group.
Great. No, my group was very, very interested, and we had a very long discussion on the actual data itself. on the indicators from two different surveys, looking at consumption indicators, looking at livelihood coping indicators, seeing if they all agree, seeing if they don't agree. What are some of the reasons why that could happen in a particular case, whether that's from biases in the methodology, whether it's face-to-face or computer-assisted, maybe it's on the different times that these surveys were collected. We also looked at some of the response options that you would get in a normal assessment. And what does that mean? And what does it mean in the big so what question that we would ask for? What does it mean for food security? If you're looking at indicators, really translating survey data into something at the household level, taking it from a number and what does it actually mean? We didn't get to a classification, but that's something we would love to explore here with you all in group. I think I had Hillary from our group who maybe could add a few points, and anyone else from the group, please feel free to jump in. The floor is open.
Yeah, so thank you, Ryan. That was a really good discussion and an excellent illustration of how two different ways of surveying came up with quite different results and different classifications with the different indicators. So we're discussing about the face-to-face versus the telephone interviews. So discussing one of the things Ryan was highlighting was looking at the methodology and looking at the robustness of the methodology as well. And the population that are being surveyed. So for example, if a face-to-face, is that more acceptable than a telephone interview? So the types of information that is being given, there might be some questions that are taboo, and that may be the reason that we're getting some different answers between the two surveys. Another thing that we all need to think about is the population, but also when it was collected. So rather than just focusing on maybe the way the methodology for the two different surveys is different, it might be that they were collected at different times. So we didn't really get to what the questions. I think we got to two of the questions, but we didn't get to what kind of crisis. But we sort of started thinking about that it might have been more of a long-term crisis, and so maybe these surveys were asked at slightly different times. But what an interesting exercise that Ryan did with us was that in the first table he had included the lifestyle coping surveys and looking at the difference with the two. But then he removed that, and so we had indicators of food consumption, coping, and household hunger scale, and those seem to align better by removing that one survey. But also what he highlighted was that they align better for the extreme factors, for severe and very severe, but didn't align maybe for the moderate phase 3. And then I think that was all. There was a lot. There was also a discussion on because 23% of the population were being assisted with 70% of their daily ration. So there was also discussion about that and how that may be distributed, and that there may be things like loss, so due to storage loss or sharing or selling of those assistants. So that might also be impacting the results of the survey.
Excellent, Hillary. Thank you for that. I don't see any other colleagues from the group with their hands up, but otherwise feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I'll pass it back over to Scott. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you indeed. Thank you to all the groups. So the one outstanding question, and I think it was, Yanni, your group did reach a tentative classification. I wonder, would you like to share that, or shall we put it into the chat? I mean, what's the best way of bringing it out? Maybe we could slowly build it up between us, and then Ryan, maybe you could just facilitate a conversation that draw in your groups to be able to also classify, or how would you like to do this so that we all reach it? We almost reach consensus together.
Well, I think the key word there is entirely consensus. And I think the right thing to do is that Ryan's about, I imagine, to share us this slide. Yes, awesome. This was the slide I was expecting. So, colleagues, with what we've looked at, whether we've looked at the overall bigger picture contributing factors, or whether you got really deep into the ins and outs of the indicators, Given these phase descriptions, and for the purposes of this exercise, I would encourage you to read that short paragraph rather than concentrating on the titling. But looking at those short descriptions there, how would you classify this particular location? What do you think it is? Which one of these phases best reflects what you saw in the data, in the information that was given to you? Just pop the number into the chat. And if you want to add a little bit of supporting explanation, please do that too. All right, thanks everyone who's put in their suggestions. It is and Jean d'Arc tells us it is definitely not phase 1, 4, or 5. Okay, and that is consistent with what we've seen here, is that all of the votes that have come in are phase 2 or phase 3. It's there's a couple of and I think so that there we have, I think, Ryan, thus something of a consensus emerging. At least we've narrowed it down somewhat. And I think Anjali has qualified hers by saying, if not supported immediately, it would go to phase 3. So in other words, it's phase 2 probably now, but it could very quickly tip over into phase 2. One more vote on phase 3. And Rema is noticing that also there's no that there wasn't much data on malnutrition or depletion of livelihoods, which she feels would have also put our group in a better position to speak more completely on this topic. But I would say if I had to base just on a straw poll, and I would stress colleagues that we actually never work like this. This is not how we do. But if we were to simply put it as a in terms of majority rule, it looks like we're saying phase 3, Ryan. That looks like what we're going to say. With a trend towards phase 2 rather than a trend towards phase 4, if that helps.
Okay, I think that's very helpful. I think this would be the approach that we would do in the IPC analysis. So I would ask all of the different analyst groups that were here, the different teams that were working on it, and I think exactly as Arena's done in the chat here, highlighting specific evidence which may help us on this discussion. Arena here is saying, taking into account that some coping strategies are applied to 30%, or sorry, I'm misreading the chat. Some very specific coping strategies were applied, and also 30% of the population have poor food consumption score, which may suggest a higher severity for some of those indicators. So as the IPC analysis goes, we don't only look at outcome indicators and all of these survey assessments that may come forward. We also look at the contributing factors, things that are also there and present. And I'm really curious for anyone in Yanni's group, if you also had a discussion on the kilocalories, or where does the majority of this food come from? And maybe that also will help us, because maybe the surveys were collected before the shock, and maybe we're looking at a different situation now. I don't know if anyone in group 1 had any comments there, or maybe over to you, Yanni.
I think for the purposes of time, I'll just say, Ryan, we did, and what Ryan is alluding to here, if you didn't see those data, was that, yes, exactly as Rema's mentioned, this place is heavily import dependent, and it's reliant for at least 50% of all of its food from imports, and specifically from imports from Russia and Ukraine, both of which are compromised by the conflict there. So there was this very high import dependency, but I would say that our group looked also very much at the impacts at household level, and this was also very crucial. Rema showing an incredible retention there, being able to quote the statistics more or less at will, that she's quite right. There was 13% storage in terms of available food stocks at national level, which also goes to underscore that import reliance. So yes, and then Scott's adding also they were struck by the port blast and the proximity of conflict as well in the context. So yes, it did come up for sure. Over.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And I think one of the other points I wanted to highlight here is some analysts will focus a lot more on contributing factors. Some analysts will focus a lot more on outcome elements or the indicators, and some will focus a lot more on the relationship that they have between them. So all three are perfectly acceptable approaches within the IPC, and this is why it's such a rich process, to get all of these different viewpoints. And if this were a real analysis, we would have a far lengthier discussion on what IPC phase this would be, the justification of why it is in this particular phase, and we would have a concluding statement to explain to other analysts, decision makers, and operational partners why this area is in phase 3, and what are the key drivers that are really causing acute food insecurity. Is it an availability crisis? Is it an accessibility issue? Is it more about utilizing the food resource? Is it a utilization issue? Or is it all three? All of these would need to be discussed in plenary and in the analysis to really have more information than just it's a phase 3, because this is the starting point. And of course, it's great if the group can agree and we reach consensus, but that's usually the starting point for even more discussions that allow the IPC analysis to identify the 6 questions that really 5 to 6 questions that were put forward in the very beginning. Now, I know this is a bit of a difficult one, but does anyone remember those questions of what the IPC is trying to do? And maybe I'll pass over to Scott on this one. If we say it's a phase 3, does this answer all of the questions, or is more needed from the IPC analysis?
Ryan, very clearly what you've done is assimilated. You've built this picture from the 3 groups and you've brought them together and you've shown where there are gaps and where there's opportunities, but still there are some gaps. We need to really engage this over time. We need to go back to our groups. We need to rethink. We need to return. We need to particularly be looking at those key outcome indicators and what evidence we have. So we haven't got any real sense of population data, really. We have a sense of perhaps some of the underlying reasons, although we do need so much more. We do have a sense of the kind of locality, but where exactly, we don't have. Here, as a group, we've worked with what is available. We've come to a conclusion. We've been able to tentatively classify a particular area, but very clearly, if we are true to ourselves, we need to return to our groups and we need to be seeking more evidence. So I think this is a very clear and very apt way of sort of bringing it all together on the hour after 2 hours. So thank you, Ryan, for doing that so clearly. Colleagues, there is a real opportunity to engage. Certainly Yanni and myself and Ryan are all connected through the ANH. You can find us in terms of those linkages, but also you could find us online in terms of the invitation to this particular learning lab. We are very open to engage and we're very open to explore opportunities to perhaps seek, I wouldn't say collaboration, but opportunities of engagement, and who knows where that may lead. Shailen, I'm going to turn over to you, having thanked Yanni and Ryan and certainly all the colleagues for participating. Shailen, just over to you.
Of course. Thank you so much. So we can wrap up this session. Thank you to our wonderful facilitators for this informative and very engaging session. And thank you to everyone who joined. We appreciate your thoughtful participation. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your day, evening. And thank you so much for joining.